Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm here for a special episode. I'm with Matt Meyer, all the way down from Moscow, Idaho. Flew down here to Lusaka, Zambia. Thanks for joining me.
You're very welcome. I don't know if we're flying down to Zambia or over to Zambia, but here we are in Zambia. Yeah.
I think it's down on the map, but
Okay.
yeah, it's so far you just kind of forget. So, quick introduction. You're a husband. You're a father. You were just telling me that you spent 20 years in the mining industry as a superintendent, and then you're now a field coordinator for South African Wycliffe Bible Translations.
Yes, yeah. So I went to school at the University of Idaho in Moscow, 81, 85. Graduated from there and started working for an international mining company called Broken Hill Proprietors, and that is an Australian company, and they had operations in Australia and South America and various places around the world. And I worked for them for 20 years, during which time raised a family, and eventually retired in 2006 and moved back to Moscow. Yeah.
Ah, there you go. Yeah, nice. And why Moscow?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, my wife and I we were in Indonesia at the time, and I came home and was describing to her an event where we were in the jungle, and a bunch of guys came out with parangs, like they're like long knives that they use to kind of cut the bush.
Yeah.
And they were threatening us, and then because we were trying to, I can't remember exactly where we were trying to go, but then I was sharing that story with her, and she's like, well, what happens if you don't come back from the bush? What if you're out in the bush and you don't come back? And here I am.
hadn't thought of that.
What am I going to do, you know?
Yeah.
And so we were talking about, well, okay, where would you want to live if I didn't come home? And she said, well, at that time we had 4 children, and and she goes, well, I'd want to be somewhere where there were like men, that would be good role models for our boys, because
Right.
we had 3 boys and 1 girl. And she goes, I want to be somewhere there's good role models, and I want to be close to family. And so we had family in Moscow, my sister Sue and her husband Wes Struble, and also there'd be good role models there. And she's like, well, that's where I go. I'd go to Moscow.
There you go.
That's where I'd find a house or whatever. And so we ended up buying land there while I was still in Indonesia, and eventually we moved there.
Yeah. That's wild. Yeah, and then so you jumped all over the globe with Wycliffe Bible Translations, is that correct? Or
No,
with mining?
no. So
With
this
the
is all mining.
Okay.
So we started off in New Mexico, and then we went to San Francisco, and that was my first, what I called overseas experience. Overseas in the sense that it was like a foreign environment. Anyway.
Yeah.
So then we went to South America. We lived in Brazil for 2 years. Then we worked 4 years in Indonesia. And then we went to northern Canada, worked in the northern part in Calgary, and then in northern Alberta for 8 years total, and then moved back to Moscow.
So what were you mining?
So in New Mexico, we mined coal. So we fed a coal, what they called a mine mouth power plant. So the coal came right out of the ground, straight into the power plant to fuel a power generation. And then from there, we went to Brazil, where I mined iron ore. So
Okay.
we mined this type of iron ore called an atabarite, which we concentrated and then sent overseas to be used in making pig iron and steel. And then from there we went to Indonesia, where we mined both steam coal and then a coking coal. So steam coal is like for power generation. A coking coal is like a higher grade. It's used for making steel. That mainly went to Japan, and then the rest of it went to kind of like Hong Kong and Malaysia and Indonesia and India and different places.
Yeah, and this is all for the same company?
Yeah, and then finally we moved to northern Canada. Yeah, it's all same company. Northern Canada, I mined oil sands. So that's like a tarry kind of sand.
Okay.
That is it's like the best way to think about it is like if you've been out on a asphalt road on a hot summer day and you smell this asphalt, and it's kind of this crumbly, people are laying down like asphalt. It's that kind of material, but it's like 100, 300 feet of that material in the ground, and you dig it out and you wash it basically to get the oil off, and then you process it.
Yeah, and that's not oil that can be used to make petrol or petroleum.
Oh no, it can be.
products.
So it's what they call heavy oil. So if you think about like Oil is just carbon chains.
Yep.
So if you were using a paint thinner, that might only have 5 or 6 carbons around, 5 or 6 C's with all the H's. And if you have an asphalt carbon molecule, it might have 2,000 or 3,000 carbon C's surrounded by H's and other things that get wrapped up. Because when the carbon molecule gets that long, it wraps itself around looks like chicken wire, and it can wrap up other things inside of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's wild.
So then when you process it, you essentially, well, you want the story?
Yeah. Sure. Absolutely.
Right. So oil sands, the best way to think about it is like it's sand surrounded with oil. So like a grape, you have a seed, it's like the sand,
Yep.
surrounded by water, which is like the juice of the grape, and then the skin of the grape is the actual oil. And so when you process it by heating it and a little bit of chemical, a little bit of agitation, the surface tension changes, and basically the oil is like the grape skin spits out the seed and it floats. And then you take that material, which is mostly oil, let's say 90% oil, and some dirt, a little bit of water, and you mix it with paint thinner, which is C5, C6, so 5 carbons, 6 carbons. You mix that with this very heavy oil, and it absorbs the oil, and it pushes out, by virtue of density, the water, the dirt, and the heaviest asphaltenes. And the rest of it floats to the top. And then you can put that through distillation columns and different things to essentially process the oil into various grades, including light oil all the way down to very heavy oil.
Okay. Wow. And did you always want to get into this kind of work?
No. So when I was your age, well, actually younger than you, when I was in high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I was okay in math and science. And I remember some professors came down from the University of Idaho, and they met, with college kids that were interested in high school kids interested in the University of Idaho. And they said, look, if we're here from the College of Mines, and we have a lot of scholarships, so if you graduate from Idaho High School, we pretty much can give you a full ride scholarship. That's all you had to do to qualify.
Wow.
And I was from a broken home. My mom worked at a nursing home. We were definitely lower middle class. Didn't have any money, and I thought that sounds like a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
I think I want to become a mining engineer, and I had no idea what a mine was. Didn't know the difference from that and a hole in the ground. And so I said, look, I'll try that for 2 years. And in engineering, most of the stuff that you take in your first 2 years is the same, whether you're doing electrical or chemical or mechanical or whatever. So I said, hey, I'll just go and try that for a while. So I did.
Yeah, there you go. And eventually it ended up with you all over the globe.
There we are, yeah. So I think it was my second summer I worked at a mine in southern Idaho, a phosphate mine.
Okay.
And I enjoyed the idea of being in the office and being out in the field. I just liked the variety.
Yeah.
And so I ended up loving it, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's wild. And then, so you, not only you've traveled around the world for work, but you've also, with Wycliffe Bible Translations, you're here in Africa now,
Right.
And then you've been other places around the globe. So what exactly is Wycliffe Bible Translations, and how did you get into that?
Well, Wycliffe Bible Translators are a function of Cameron. I'm trying to remember his full name. But the guy who started Wycliffe Bible Translators, essentially almost 100 years ago, 80 years ago, started doing translations in Mexico. He basically was down there selling Bibles to the Spanish Bibles, but a lot of the people that were local didn't speak Spanish. And so he's like, this doesn't make sense, so we should be able to translate the Bible from Spanish into their colloquial language, their heart language. We call it their heart language. And so that's what he started doing, and found it was extremely productive in terms of them understanding the Word of God and being transformed by the gospel. So he started teaching other people to do this, and he did that during the summertime. And that became the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is now called SIL. And that is an organization that has grown and is kind of respected worldwide for linguistics and linguistic studies. And they kind of are I would call it like the UN type side of Bible translation. So they can go in there like professors and people who are scholastically approaching linguistics, helping a country understand how many languages they have. They develop the ISO codes for define what's a language, what's not a language, what's a dialect, what's a variant. Anyway, so SIL then kind of grew into two halves, one more technically oriented and one more translation and even evangelistically oriented. So that became Wycliffe. And so as Wycliffe grew in terms of an organization, how they did the translations has transformed over the last 80 years.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
initially you'd have somebody, let's say, was a Northern European generally, or from Europe or America, who studied linguistics and then went over into a people group, spent time learning their language, creating an orthography, like how it might be written, and then translating the Bible into their language. Now much more of that is being done by people who are national, who already know the language and also know, let's say, a language of broader communication like English or French or Spanish. And then they're now doing translations for their people groups in a much quicker way, because it's kind of, there's a church there now. Before there was no church. Now there's a church there, there's people who know the language. Anyway, so that's a long story of what Wycliffe is. Wycliffe, now I'm working for a segment of Wycliffe called Wycliffe Global Partners. And so what we're doing is we're partnering with other translating organizations and local churches to help them do the translation themselves. Maybe we do some consulting work and different things to help them, finance them, but we're not coming in and doing all the work.
Yeah.
So my role is to help facilitate that, because I'm not smart enough to be a translator. So we have a Wycliffe family that we've supported for 30 years in our church, the Leidenfrosts. Maybe you've already interviewed them. And the Leidenfrosts, he did that. He learned French, then he learned Bachwe, and then he spent 30 years doing the New Testament. And so when I talked to Chaba, the Leidenfrost who had done this work, and I said, Chaba, I'm looking for something that God would have me to do, since I'm done with mining. I'm done helping work at Community Christian Ministries. I served Jim for about 12 years. And I'm looking for something where I think God could use us. And he goes, well, try Wycliffe Bible Translators. And I said, I'm not smart enough to be a translator. And he goes, oh, they need people like you too. I said, thank you, Chaba. And I said, so I can be a project engineer. So basically I help organize a project, the budgeting, the planning, and then I present that to people who give that to donors. And then as the money goes into the project, I track that to make sure the money's being spent to achieve the targets.
Okay, so similar to what you were doing with mining.
Kind of, yeah. So it uses the mining skills of project engineering, planning, that kind of thing, budgeting, tracking, but for Bible translation, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then how long have you been doing that?
So I had my first exposure to that in 2018, where I came to Zambia, actually, where we are. That was my first. So basically, I called up one of the fellows in Wycliffe, and I said, hey, I'm interested in this. And he goes, well, what are you doing in 2 weeks? I said, I don't know. Why? And he goes, well, we have a training going on in Lusaka here in Zambia, and you can go to that training. I said, look, I've only talked to you for 5 minutes on the phone, and you're inviting me to go to Zambia, Lusaka, I don't even know where that is, and do training? And he goes, yeah, I think you're the right person for this activity. And I'm like, I said, I don't think that's right. I said, one, I haven't prayed about it, and two, I don't think it's a good use of God's money. Like, if you're going to pay that, that's expensive to fly to Africa in short notice. And he goes, no, I got a lot of spare miles. He says, I said, well, if you can give me let me pray about it, and if you can give me a cheap ticket, I'll go. So sure enough, he gave me a cheap ticket. The next thing I know, I'm in here in Lusaka 4 years ago.
Yeah, and what were you doing in Lusaka?
Well, we did this training for a week. So learned learned about Wycliffe, learned about their principles and the procedures, and how to actually do the coordination of building a project. And after I had done that for a week and met these people from all over Africa, as well as people from Wycliffe who were doing the training, I came back home and I told Renee, my wife, I was like, this is amazing. I think we can do this. Like,
yeah.
We're comfortable overseas. We know some different languages. We want to be strategic in what we do with the rest of our lives. And I think this fits. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fun. And then you are specifically you do Wycliffe Bible translations for Southern Africa. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Wycliffe Global Partners divides the world into 7 major areas, like the Americas. Africa's split into what they call Anglophone, Lusophone, and Francophone. So the French-speaking is one section, and the English and Portuguese-speaking is the other section. So that's why I work with that team. So it's mostly Sudan all the way through Southern Africa, and then a few little spots like Nigeria speaks English, Guinea-Bissau would speak Portuguese, Angola, Portuguese, Madagascar, French. That kind of stuff.
And did you choose you wanted to go there as opposed to somewhere in the Americas?
Well, the Americas was mostly done, pretty much. There's not many languages left. But the two areas they needed help were Africa, East Africa, and Indonesia. And I really thought I should go to Indonesia because I had worked 4 years in Indonesia, and I spoke some Bahasa, and so I thought, oh, that's probably where I should go. But the fellow who was responsible for that, who actually has a daughter at NSA, he was like, no, right now we don't quite need you. Whereas the guy in Africa, Steve, he was like, no, we need somebody right now, so why don't you join our team? So I ended up joining the African team.
Yeah, and then so you project manage, but do you actually do you spend a lot of time going to these countries?
Not a huge amount of time. I mean, I just spent a week in South Africa at a language conference, a sign language conference, and then here I'm in Zambia for 4 or 5 days meeting with people here. So several times a year I'll be traveling to Africa and meeting with different groups, but it's not like I live in Africa. It's more I come and visit a project and do a lot of stuff by Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you traveled around the world and then also in Idaho, I was talking to Isaac and he was saying that you have hiked every hot spring in Idaho. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's about 125 natural, public. They're like open to the public. They're like a National Forest Service land or non-private land, and there's a little over 120 hot springs, of which I've visited all the hot springs in Idaho. Yeah.
Wild. And why the hot springs?
Well, I like I like to get out. I like to hike, and I like to have a goal. And so having a goal, it just kind of helps, motivate you. It's like, oh, I haven't been there yet. I'm going to plan on that next week, or I'm going to go over there. And I like to see new things, and so that was a way of really. And also, I love hot springs actually. So
really,
yeah, I love hot springs. Yeah,
what about hot springs?
Well, I mean, most of them are out in the countryside, out in the mountains, out somewhere pretty remote. They're just like taking a hot bath. It's like like being in a jacuzzi without the bubbles, sometimes with bubbles, and just being in nature and it's warm, it's hot, it's delightful. Yeah. Yeah,
and then you were telling me that you hiked with your brother-in-law the Olympus Trail.
Yeah, it's called the Bailey Loop. It basically goes from Solid Duck Hot Springs around, climbs Mount Olympus, and then back to the hot springs. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you were saying you had some pretty wild stories from
Pretty wild stories, yeah. I mean, it's very exposed. You're on this ridge. It's cross country, which means you're not on trails. You cross 3 glaciers. So yeah, it's a little more technical. Yeah, and then we had some scrapes, but we did okay.
Yeah. Have you always been a hiker?
Yeah, my first hiking was when I was like 12. My sister, Sue, was very outdoorsy, and so started hiking with her. Did a section of the Pacific Crest Trail when I was 12, which was a disaster, hiking with her, but I definitely kind of caught the bug. I read this, I was really motivated by National Geographic, which talked about the Pacific Crest Trail, which is 2,600 miles, goes from Mexico to Canada along the Rockies. And I just dreamt about that from the time I was 12, and I've just enjoyed being outside ever since.
Yeah, and have you ever actually done the Pacific Crest Trail?
Not the whole thing, but I've done segments of it. So every year I try to do a segment of the trail.
There you go. Maybe at some point you'll finish it.
Yeah, the 2,600 miles. I think there's sections. I mean, life is too short to do the whole thing. I think
Yeah.
It's like a 6-month thing, and so I would say out of the 2,600 miles, there's probably 400 or 500 that are really spectacular, and that's what I focus on.
Yeah, and what's the best place you've hiked, like across the globe? Because were you hiking in other places around the globe as well, or just have it mainly been in America?
Well, yeah, no, I've hiked around like Mont Blanc which goes through France and Italy and Switzerland, and I've hiked. We just got back from the Torres del Paine Park, which is in Patagonia. We did 85 miles there about a month ago. And I've done some other smaller hikes in different parts. I climbed Kilimanjaro.
Impressive.
And we've hiked in Alaska and in different places in Canada, but like in the Banff and and Jasper National Parks. So yeah, I've hiked in numerous places. I hiked around. I've done all the volcanoes all along the west coast. So like Mount Whitney and Mount Adams, and so I try to do a volcano or a mountain every year, something new. Done a number of 14ers in Colorado, and so yeah, I've done quite a bit of hiking. Where's the best? That's really hard to say. I'm an Idaho boy, so I kind of have a certain affinity just for Idaho.
Yeah.
And the Sawtooth is where I did most of my first hiking. So the Sawtooths, which are in central Idaho, would be like my favorite. Yeah.
Good to know. And that's something that's accessible to the public, correct?
Yeah, unfortunately too accessible. So now that Boise is getting bigger, there's a lot more people in the Sawtooth. So you have to go deeper in to get away from the crowds.
Yeah, unfortunate. And I'm sure you've got some wild stories from hiking.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. You know, it's so funny. Like kids, I'd tell like nighttime stories to my kids.
Yeah.
And so I tell them, I say, hey, you pick an age and I'll give you a story, or you pick a date and I'll give you a story. So it's kind of hard just to come up with a story just without kind of being kind of triggered or like thinking about something. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of your kids, you adopted 2 girls from Africa, from Ethiopia, correct?
Yeah. So we have 9 kids. They range from 16 to 36, and 2 of them are adopted. We adopted them from Ethiopia in 2006. And at that time, one was 6 months old. That's Malat. Well, I mean, now she's 18, but she was 6 months old. And Kalkadan was 2.5 at that time. Yeah, so we adopted them. And then we had our last son, Zizé, a year after.
And this was just as you retired, correct?
Yeah, so I had left mining in 2006, and we were in Canada, and we actually adopted them in Canada. They arrived in Canada in May, and we left Canada in August.
Okay, so, that's pretty wild. So what prompted you to do that?
So it was in 2005. I'd come home in March. It was my birthday. And Renee was like, hey, we're going to go out for your birthday. I'm like, oh, that's great. That sounds good. What are we going to do? She goes, well, we're going to go out for dinner, but first we're going to go to this presentation. I'm like, okay, let's go. So my daughter, my oldest daughter, Katura, had seen an advertisement for adopting baby girls from China, because China had, for 30 years, had a one-child policy, and because families favored boys, they would do a sex selection. They would either abort or abandon their baby girls. So let's say you had a baby girl, you wanted to have a baby boy, you'd either abort or you'd abandon. And so because you had a lot of abandoned baby girls, they were in horrible situations of being orphaned, being abused, being sold, all sorts of terrible things. So that was what this presentation was about. So we went to this presentation about these situation in China, and it was horrible. It was, if you could just think of all the terrible things that could be done to these abandoned baby girls, those things happened. And I came out of the presentation, and my wife was like, what do you think? What do you think about adopting, girls from China? I said, that was like the worst presentation that's like never do that to a person on their birthday. Like I feel sick. I was actually literally sick to my stomach. I mean, it was horrible. It was just emotionally devastating to watch. I didn't know anything about this. And then to see it like in graphic terms, I said, no, that's just terrible. And so when we got home, my wife told my daughter, she said, don't talk to Dad about adoption. He wasn't very impressed with the presentation. And I wasn't impressed. It was just so shocking, and it was my birthday. Anyway, and at that time, we had 6 kids, and our youngest was Talus. He was 5 years old. So we had sold all of our baby stuff. I mean, I was like, God, you have blessed us. We have 6 kids. It's like, yeah,
we're gonna move on.
Our quiver is full. We're moving on in life.
Yeah.
And adopt? Are you crazy? And of course, then you start talking to people, and they're like, don't adopt. You can't. You don't know how these adopted kids are going to turn out. They're going to be disaster, and so a lot of discouragement in that area. But I was praying about it for about a month, and I felt convicted that no, that's something we can do, and I thought we should do. But I thought if we're going to adopt, let's just go for it. So I told my wife, and within days she was just like, chasing
fantastic.
All these things. I mean, she was just boom, 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 boom. But what was happening in China in 2005 was they were preparing for the Olympics in 2008, and they were changing their policies. It was very embarrassing to have it publicly known that all these things were happening in China. So they were kind of closing down their adoption policies. And so after about a month of work, we discovered that we weren't qualified. And a combination of, you're too old, you have too many kids, it's just not going to work. And so I told Renee, it's like, well, that must be God's indication to us that we're not supposed to adopt. And she's like, you have no idea how to understand God's will. It just means we're not supposed to adopt from China. And I'm like, oh, okay, right. So during this time, I had been to a conference in Vancouver, a mining conference, and I had heard the UN Secretary for AIDS in Africa make a presentation. He was a Canadian fellow, and he was one of the most eloquent speakers I've ever heard, still one of the best speakers I've ever heard. And he talked about AIDS, the impact of AIDS, the fact that we're 70 million orphans across East Africa because of the devastation. I mean, a whole swath of 20 to 40-year-olds were taken out by AIDS. So the middle generation, so you had grandparents and you had babies. Anyway, it was a huge problem. And I said, well, look, if we're going to adopt, let's connect ourselves not just to these kids, but let's connect ourselves to something that's significant in terms of a worldwide problem.
Right.
And at that time, in terms of countries where you could adopt internationally, Ethiopia was functional. Some people would use Albania, not so functional. Russia, again, not very functional. Haiti, terribly dysfunctional.
Yeah.
So the place that were internationally available, Ethiopia, is East Africa, and it was working. And so we chose East Africa, and within a year we had our 2 girls.
Yeah, that's wild. So what would your encouragement or recommendation be to other people who are maybe looking to adopt? Has the environment shifted? Because you couldn't adopt from China back in 2005. Has that have things opened up now more?
I haven't been as close to international adoption, as I was back then, but I think it's actually closed down. I think it's harder to adopt internationally now than probably ever.
Wow.
So I'm sure there's still opportunities, but I guess my recommendation is I would likely encourage adoption locally in America first as an option. So my oldest son and his wife have adopted 2, their oldest kids are adopted, and their third is an embryo adoption. So they really have 3 of our grandchildren are adopted. So I think adoption is biblical. It's we're adopted. The Bible says we're adopted. So it's a beautiful picture of God's love. So I'm very supportive of adoption, but I'm also, if people said, do you think we should adopt? I'd be like, you better go into it with your eyes open, because it's, we had 6 kids. Everything was going great. I thought we were amazing parents. So I thought adoption should be nothing, we just slip them right in, and they wouldn't even know the difference. But adopting, there's a lot of things that you may not understand, and having to do with, it's like, what do you call it? Attachment disorders. In other words, how they attach, the things that they've kind of carried, which you don't know about, what kind of trauma they may have experienced as even as our children, even if they're 2 or 3 years old. You think, well, they don't remember anything, but our oldest, Kalkadan, was fully verbal. I mean, she was very verbal and very sharp. So what she might have experienced as a 2 or 3-year-old in terms of seeing her mother die, or what kind of trauma she may have experienced as a young child, you don't know. Or what kind of, in Ethiopia, their drug of choice is this thing called chat, which is like a narcotic, which they chew. You don't know what kind of impact. These are all things that people say, well, if you don't know what you're getting into. And it's true, you don't know what you're getting into. So it's a step of faith that you just need to go into with your eyes open, knowing that it's not just like you snap your fingers and these kids just kind of show up on your doorstep, ready to go. Yeah. So it's been wonderful. I wouldn't go back. Couldn't even imagine not having my daughters. Yeah. But it was definitely an eye-opening experience in terms of challenge as a parent. Yeah. It's a new world. It's a beautiful world, but it's definitely a faith oriented experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Why has the market kind of closed down in the past couple years?
I think there's it doesn't look good, like politically.
That's fair. Yeah.
I think that's the biggest issue. And I think also people have experienced enough problems in a place like Haiti, which now you couldn't adopt if
Yeah,
you wanted to.
they're having a cannibal problem there at the
Yes.
moment.
Well, yeah. So anyway, it's just so either the country is so dysfunctional it doesn't work, or if the country is functional, it's embarrassing. Like it was embarrassing for China. It was embarrassing, I think, for Ethiopia. It also has kind of like a sense of colonialization, like the white folk are adopting the black folk.
Yeah.
It has a sense now of, in terms of our current social environment, it's just less acceptable.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. But they would want people from Ethiopia to adopt the Ethiopian babies,
Sure.
but just not from outside.
Right. And whether it be Ethiopia or Brazil or any other places, the expectation is these are our people. We should take care of our people.
Yeah.
And if we don't take care of our people, then we've failed as a government. We failed as a people.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And China especially, because I know your daughter actually lived in China, or lives.
She
in
still
China?
lives in China.
Okay,
Yes,
yeah.
my oldest daughter lives and works in China, and yeah.
They've just recently dropped their one-child policy.
Yeah, I think it was about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. It's hard to keep track of time as you get older, but yeah, so it's been only several years, 2 or 3 years at most. But during that time, China was largely urbanized. So even though they've dropped their one-child policy, now people are, especially in the urban areas, I wouldn't have more than one child anyway.
Yeah, and that's there's a huge problem in China at the moment. There's like I think it was like 70 million guys that will never get married.
Yeah, it could be 70 or 100 million. It's a
like
huge, and even if there was a woman, the woman there, like, I wouldn't want to get married anyway.
Yeah.
So I mean, you have two problems. One, not enough women. And then two, the women that are there that are educated are like, I don't want to get married. There's either too much cost, or why should I,
right?
Why should I ruin my career, or why should I get married to that guy, or whatever. Or the guys can't raise enough money to actually attract the girls. It's a huge problem. And so yeah, from a standpoint of replacing their population, they're probably below 1 in terms of births per woman. And so yeah, they're in a massive demographic decline.
Yeah.
Which we've never seen.
No.
I mean, unless you had the Black Plague or something like that, we've never experienced the kind of depopulation we're going to see in China, in Korea.
Yeah.
We're seeing in Japan. We'll see in Europe.
Yeah, no, Japan, China, and Korea. It's you won't know anything about it because they'll hide it from you. But with Japan, it's been very open.
Yeah.
Watching them freak out because they don't have any kids.
Yeah, and abandoned cities, empty cities and stuff.
Yeah. That's one of the cool things about Zambia is the median age here is 17.
Right.
Which more kids than adults.
Yeah.
Which is great and good for the youth and vitalization of a growing nation.
Sure.
So what got you? What got you here in Zambia? Not with Wycliffe Bible Translations, but the first time in 2018.
No, that was with Wycliffe.
Oh, that was. Okay.
Yeah, so I was here for training. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have shown up in Zambia. It wasn't like on my list of I got to go to Zambia kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, what makes you interested in Africa? Is it just this was what was open, or is there something else that you find interesting about Africa?
Well, I mean, our girls are from Africa, so I think we have a connection to Africa through our daughters. So that's interesting to me. Africa is just an amazing continent. I mean, it's just massive, and it's so varied. So it's just an interesting place, just in itself. Africa is. So I'm interested in it for that perspective. I think interested just to learn more about it. I mean, when I was in, we adopted our daughters, but when I came and spent some time in Tanzania and climbed Kilimanjaro, just spending time in Africa was just very interesting to me. Spending time in Ethiopia was interesting. And I've enjoyed just getting to see different parts of Africa and seeing the different cultures. I mean, Zambia has a much different culture than South Africa, different from Ethiopia, different from Nigeria. So I think just culturally, I'm fascinated by cultures and fascinated by languages and cultures and things. So Africa has more than you can count, I think.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Yeah, no, it's wild. And there's so much tribalism here, which I did not expect. But one of the first questions I got asked when I came here by some of the fellow students was, hey, what tribe are you from? I was like, well,
What tribe are you from?
I don't know. I'm not from a tribe, I don't think. At least not that I've taken account of. But then, so you've traveled all over the world and you've seen all these different cultures, and then you've worked with Wycliffe Bible Translation.
Yeah.
How does Christianity take a culture and make it Christian, while at the same time keeping some of the things that makes that culture so keeping that culture's identity?
Sure. Well, I think we've been extremely blessed to be able to have experienced Christianity in different countries and different kind of cultures. Extremely blessed. So, for an example, in Brazil, when we went to Brazil in 1992 or 93, as the end of 1992. You had a country that was ostensibly Christian. It was a Catholic country, by and large a Catholic country, that had been under a military dictatorship with Sarney. And he had just stepped down, and the country was democratizing. And in many ways, it was throwing off not just the previous military junta, but they were throwing off the church, the Catholic Church, because the two were kind of cheek and jowl. Yeah, they were hooked together, and they wanted to throw off both. And so then you see this explosion of people either going into some level of hedonism, some level of spiritism, like Macumba and different African kind of spiritism. Because there's a lot of African roots in Brazil. And then you have people going into different forms of evangelical Christianity. So whether it be more charismatic type, Pentecostal type branches, or just the growth of the Christian church in general. So it's had a very transforming effect, I think, in Brazil politically and culturally, as that kind of release of, I think, kind of Protestantism has spread across mainstream Brazil. But the Brazilians are just as Brazilian as they were when I was there 30 years ago, as they are this last year when I visited Brazil in Porto Alegre and Joinville, visiting some of the churches that our church is sponsoring or our denomination is sponsoring. So I think the transformation has to do, I think, more in terms of how they relate to one another, how they do their business, how they act, I think, more politically. And again, even though it's together, the country would be considered like a Christian country, it's still, I would call it still young in terms of its Christianity. So they're wrestling through issues even now as to how Christianity affects education. In other words, is it the state that does education, or is it we as parents have responsibility to raise our children in nurture and admonition of the Lord? How does that work? So there's a lot of change that's happening even now in a country like Brazil. So that's just one example. And then if you went to Indonesia, where we lived for 4 years, you could go and see, Christian churches as a minority, a small minority within a largely Muslim country context, how they were operating. So Indonesia encourages kind of like we all get together, you get along with one another. But at the same time, I heard a quote just recently where the president of Indonesia said, don't be like beating up on the Christians. If you beat on the Christians, they get together and they become strong. But if you leave them alone, they fight with one another, eat one another up, and they become weak. So
at least he understands that.
So he has a pretty good idea about how Christianity works. But yeah, I mean, I think, but even there, you could see a kind of Christianity that was still very vibrant, very alive, but it certainly contextualized within an environment, in that case, a very Muslim-oriented environment versus, we might experience in Brazil or in somewhere else.
Yeah. And then how does, one of the things that I've kind of run into here is sometimes people here think of Christianity as kind of a white man or Western religion.
Sure.
How does, for a missionary who's looking to go out there and preach the gospel to some of these people, how does he make the gospel seem not like a white man religion, but more as like the religion for all peoples?
Well, I think now he's in a much easier situation than they were back 100 years ago or 200 years or whatever, 500 years ago, because there are, let's just imagine, just as an example, there's roughly 7,000 languages worldwide. And each of those languages have a connection to some culture that might have been created because of geography, like in Papua New Guinea, where you have a valley and the people have never left the valley for the last 500 years, and they developed their own language. Or a tribe, like there's 500 languages in Nigeria alone, and each one of those is related to a tribe and a little kingdom or something. And here in Zambia, for example, there's recognized 73 different languages, and there's more, but let's say there's 73 recognized languages, and each of those languages generally has a chief, a king, associated with that language. And so that culture, is distinct, but yet it's almost, they're, generally you'll find a believer or more in these different language groups. And so nowadays you can go into that language group, find a believer, encourage them to start a Bible study, encourage them to use the Word of God to invite their neighbors to know Christ. And the church, therefore, is indigenous. It's not the white man coming in and doing the work.
Yeah.
So there's already, if you think about it, Africa's more Christian than the United States practically.
Yeah.
So you don't, certainly
at least
Zambia,
in name.
Yeah, certainly name. And sure, there's lots of syncretism. There's lots of problems with bad theology and everything else.
ATR and yes.
But nonetheless, the influence of Christianity and the availability of God's Word is prevalent. It's not like these people don't have any opportunity to be exposed to the gospel. And so as a result, you see, and people are evangelistic. Generally the best are evangelistic. And so they're getting into the corners. And so nowadays I think it's kind of past being a white man's religion, because there's plenty of folks that don't look like a white guy who are believers. All you gotta do is look around in Zambia, so. Yeah,
no, definitely true. So what would your encouragement be to both missionaries and also just young people who would like to travel and who would like to kind of experience the world?
Well, I think there's some great organizations like YWAM and others where a young person can go to a discipleship training school in pretty much any country, well, not any country in the world, but many countries around the globe that aren't completely closed, and be trained in evangelism, trained in cross-cultural experience, and have an opportunity, first of all, just experience the world. So like before they should become a missionary, I think they should have some understanding of what it's like to live in another culture and to be a minority. My first experience as a minority was working in the Navajo Indian Reservation in New Mexico, where 90% of the guys I worked with were Native American. They were Navajo, with some Hopi and stuff thrown in there. And so I was the white guy in the brown world, and a minority. And that was an important growing experience for me. And certainly when I went to a place like Indonesia, where you can't hide as the white guy, you're clearly different from everybody else. Or like on the Navajo Indian Reservation, it clearly didn't look like a Navajo. That you're learning a certain level of humility, a certain level of appreciation for the culture. That until you do that, I think it's hard to imagine being a missionary and loving another culture until you've actually experienced it. So my advice was like, do a short-term mission, go out with YWAM, go find a relative that lives somewhere else, and have an experience. Because then I think I can tell you that you can have an appreciation for what they bring.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit on the importance of travel as a whole for kind of everyone?
Well, certainly I think for Americans, I think travel is important. We have so many blessings in America, so many blessings in terms of security and freedom of travel and wealth and everything else. It can become very comfortable. It can become super comfortable just to stay where you are. But I think we're missing, if you don't have an opportunity to get outside and actually see other things, you're missing not just the fact that this culture might be interesting and exciting and informative, but you're missing the opportunity to know what the needs are. That these people may have certain needs that you can actually address, you can actually do something to help them with. Whereas if you never get out, you don't know that even exists. You think the world is your little microcosm of going to the mall and having coffee at Starbucks or whatever. It's just like this little world that only you are exposed to. So, no, I think it's very important for those reasons. Not only what can I learn, but what can I give? And coming to a place, even a fairly wealthy place, from a standpoint of Africa and Lusaka here
Yeah.
in Zambia, there's still things that you can see. Oh, I think this could be a help to this particular country or this particular people group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been very fun. Where should people find you on the internet, or do you have a blog where you write about these things that you go and do?
Yeah, they won't find me on the internet.
Okay.
So my daughter created my Facebook page. I don't ever post to it. I did sign up for Instagram just so I could see my daughter's page. I never look at it. So I used to write small devotionals or blogs. They were more really written devotionals for when I was working with Community Christian Ministries for Jim, which we would post to like his, he now uses it like calls Roots by the River, or he would have like a little, Community Christian Ministries had a small place you go back when you read your blogs. You didn't listen to your blogs or
Yes.
see your blogcasts. But I've had a hard time being disciplined enough to do that. So it's good that you're being disciplined here, and actually kind of getting this thing recorded for eternity, in the
Yeah.
electrosphere.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I can look back in 5 years and be like, wow, I was such an idiot.
That's right. So if you want to find me, come see me in my house. Come see me in Moscow. We'll have dinner together. I'll get you organized for a hike, and
Yeah.
off we go. But people normally hike with me just once.
Yeah, and then they give up.
That's right. Except my kids, they're blood, so they have to do it. But
Yes.
but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fun. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for coming on.
Okay,
and,
you're welcome.
Have fun in your rest of the trips in Africa.
Thank you very much.
Chew with me, got a little chew with me.